Eleanor Falburn was 19 the morning they made her leave Falburn Hall through the kitchen door. One small case. No carriage, the frost still on the yard, and her breath white in front of her. She did not weep in the yard, remember that. She stood among the milk pails and the mud, and she did not give them one tear. Her stepmother had seen to the rest. The night before, in front of the whole gathered household and 2 visiting magistrates, Genevieve Falburn had held up a green emerald brooch, the dead mother's brooch, pulled fresh from the lining of Eleanor's travelling coat. 14 servants watched. 2 guests watched. And Genevieve, cool as water, said the words that would follow Eleanor for 13 years. "A thief," she said, "does not deserve a name she has disgraced." Eleanor did not argue. She only turned to the old housekeeper and asked her to keep one small thing safe. And 13 years later, in a crowded auction room, a solicitor no one recognized raised a paddle. If anyone ever told you you'd be nothing without them, this story is for you. Before we go on, do one small thing for me. Subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. Every name in the comments is one more person who knows that a girl put out with nothing does not have to stay nothing. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Eleanor Falburn was born in the west wing of a house her mother loved. It was spring of 1889 when this story truly begins, but she was born 18 years before that, in a high, bright room that faced the orchard. The window there caught the morning first. Her mother used to say that was why Eleanor woke early all her life, that the sun had come looking for her before anyone else in the house was awake. Falburn Hall stood a mile out from the little market town of Nether Wexley in the green folds of Herefordshire, and it had stood there a long time. Grey stone. Ivy on the north face. An avenue of limes that met overhead in summer like the roof of a church. Eleanor's mother was Charlotte Falburn, and she was gentle in a way the county was not. She did not keep to the drawing room. She walked the orchard rows with the tenants at Blossom time and again at harvest. She knew the names of their children. She knew which trees bore early and which bore sour, and she took her daughter with her everywhere, so that Eleanor grew up half in the great house and half in the warm, smoky kitchens and the cider sheds and the tenant cottages where a small girl was always given the first cup and the softest chair. The servants adored her. That is not a thing you say lightly, but it was true. Mrs. Pettifer, the housekeeper, had held Eleanor the day she was born and had not let much distance come between them since. It was Mrs. Pettifer who taught her to read the weather off the hills. It was Mrs. Pettifer who sat up with her through the fevers of childhood. And it was Mrs. Pettifer who was there at the end, when Charlotte Falburn grew thin and quiet, and the doctors came less often because there was less they could do. Charlotte died when Eleanor was 11. Near the end, she called her daughter to the bed and gave her 2 things. The first was a brooch, an oval emerald set in old worn gold, a stone the deep green of a wet leaf, the one thing of real worth Charlotte owned outright and not through her husband. "This was my mother's," she said, "and hers before that. It comes to you. Not to the house, to you." Eleanor kept it in a small green leather box that fit in the palm of a hand. The second thing you could not hold. Charlotte had set aside a little money in trust, £6,000, lodged with a solicitor away in Liverpool, tied up so that no one could touch it, not even Eleanor herself, until her 25th birthday. It was Charlotte's own, from her own people, and she had guarded it apart from the estate on purpose, though a girl of 11 could not have understood why. Eleanor barely thought of it. When she thought of it at all, which was seldom, she thought of it the way you think of a keepsake in a drawer, a thing that was hers and far away and would never really need to be touched. Remember that little money. It is the quietest thing in this story, and in the end it is the loudest. For a while after Charlotte died, the house held its breath. Edmund Falburn, Eleanor's father, was a decent enough man, but not a strong one, and grief made him weaker. He loved his daughter in his careful, distant way. He simply had no idea what to do with her, or with the empty rooms, or with the long evenings. So when, 3 years on, a handsome widow named Genevieve came into the county with a grown son and a great deal of charm, Edmund did not so much fall in love as fall into relief. Here was someone to run the house. Here was someone to fill the silence. They married when Eleanor was 14. Genevieve Falben was clever. That is the first thing to understand about her, and nearly the last thing anyone in Nether Wexley understood in time. She was clever, the way frost is clever. You did not see it arrive. You only woke one morning and found the whole garden changed. To Edmund she was warm. To the county she was gracious. To the servants she was correct, which is a colder thing than kindness, and is often mistaken for it. And to Eleanor, when no one was looking, she was nothing at all. A closed door, a gaze that went straight through. She had brought her son with her. Marcus Vane, 22 by the spring our story opens, a young man with good shoulders and a soft mouth and eyes that were always counting something. Marcus liked the idea of Falben Hall a great deal. He liked the avenue of limes and the good horses and the name that opened doors in the county town. What he did not like was work, or waiting, or being second to a girl 3 years younger than himself who had the older blood and the truer claim. Because that was the plain fact of it, under all the manners. Eleanor was Edmund's only child by his first wife. Eleanor was the heir. When Edmund died, the hall and the land and the standing that came with them would pass to her. Genevieve knew that fact the way you know a stone in your shoe. And a clever woman does not limp. She waits, and she plans, and she chooses her morning. So, that is the house. A grey hall in a green valley, a weak father, a watchful stepmother, a stepbrother who wanted without earning, and a girl of 19 who still woke with the first sun, still walked the orchard rows, still carried a small green box in the bottom of her case, and still believed, because no one had yet taught her otherwise, that the truth was a thing that protected you. It began with a room. That was the first move, and it was such a small one that Eleanor almost did not feel it land. She had always slept in the west wing, in the bright room that faced the orchard, the room she was born in, the room her mother had loved. 1 week in the early spring, while Eleanor was 3 days away visiting her mother's cousin, Genevieve had her things moved. Quietly, neatly, no announcement. Eleanor came home in the evening, went up the west stair out of long habit, opened the door of her room and found a sewing table where her bed had been, and bare walls and her own things nowhere. They had put her in the north box room. It was a narrow room at the cold end of the house, over the scullery, where the damp came through in winter, and the one small window looked out on the yard and the kitchen roofs. It had been a maid's room once. It was where you put a poor relation you were ashamed of. Her mother's little portrait had been taken down from the west wall and was propped, when Eleanor found it, face to the skirting in a corner, as though someone had meant to be rid of it and lost their nerve halfway. Genevieve was all reason about it. The west wing took too much coal to heat for one girl, she said. The box room was cosier, and really, Eleanor was so often out of doors, what did a bedroom matter to her? Every word of it was sensible, and every word of it was a wall going up, one brick, laid so gently you could not point to it and say, "There, that is cruelty, that is the private slight, the one no one witnesses." It does not open a debt with the world. It only teaches the girl, in a language below words, that her ground is being taken from under her, an inch at a time, by someone who smiles while she does it. Eleanor said nothing. She carried her mother's portrait up to the cold little room herself and hung it where she could see it from the bed. She told Mrs. Pettifer it was fine, truly, and Mrs. Pettifer, who had been in service 40 years and knew exactly what she was seeing, pressed her lips together and said nothing either, because there was nothing yet to say. But that night the housekeeper sat a long while by the kitchen fire after the others had gone up. She had a feeling in her chest like weather coming. She was right. The second move needed a witness. A slight in the dark is only a slight. But Genevieve did not want a slight. She wanted a story, and a story needs at least one pair of eyes that is not her own. So she was patient, as clever people are, and she waited for the house to fill. It filled at Easter. Edmund, who was already ailing that spring, a cough that would not clear, a greyness under the skin, a tiredness that kept him to his chair by afternoon, had agreed to a small gathering. A few families from the county. A magistrate or two, for Edmund still sat on the bench when he was well enough and liked to keep those men close. And staying in the house over the holiday, a Mrs. Hartley, a talkative widow from the far side of Ludlow who could carry a piece of news 30 miles before nightfall. Genevieve had chosen her guests the way a good cook chooses ingredients. Nothing in that house happened by accident anymore. On the second morning of the visit, the brooch went missing. Eleanor kept it in the green box, in the drawer of the little washstand in the north room. She had taken it out the evening before to wear it to dinner, her mother's emerald, the one beautiful thing, the one piece of her mother she could pin over her heart, and in the morning the box was there and the brooch was gone. She searched the room. She searched it twice. She did not cry out, because even then some careful part of her did not want to make a scene under that roof. She went down the back stair with a cold weight in her stomach, and she went to find Mrs. Pettifer, because Mrs. Pettifer fixed things. She never got the chance to ask. Because Genevieve was already in the passage by the linen press, and Mrs. Pettifer was with her, and so was Mrs. Hartley, the talkative widow. The three of them gathered over something with the particular stillness of people who have just found what they were looking for. Eleanor's travelling coat was in Genevieve's hands, her good grey wool coat, the one that hung on the peg by the north room, the one packed away half the year, and Genevieve had it turned inside out, and she had opened a seam in the lining, the stitches picked, the thread hanging, and she was drawing out, slow for the widow to see, the emerald brooch. Her dead sister-in-law's brooch, sewn into the lining of the girl's own coat. "Well," said Genevieve, very softly, and looked up, and let her eyes rest on Eleanor in the doorway with an expression of the deepest sorrow. "Oh, Eleanor, oh, my dear. What have you done?" It was so well made that for one terrible second Eleanor doubted her own hands. That is what a good frame does. It does not just accuse you, it makes you check yourself, makes you feel guilty of a thing you did not do. Because the evidence is right there, and evidence does not lie, does it? She stood in the doorway, and the passage tilted. Mrs. Hartley had a hand to her mouth, and Genevieve held the brooch up on her open palm like a small green wound, and shook her head, sorrowful, sorrowful, while behind her sorrow something in her eyes was as bright and satisfied as a cat's. Only Mrs. Pettifer moved. The old housekeeper stepped in close and looked, not at the brooch, but at the seam, at the neat-picked stitches, the fresh thread, the work of an unhurried hand, and Eleanor saw the housekeeper understand the whole of it in a breath. Whoever had sewn that brooch into that coat had done it slowly, in good light, at a table, not a frightened thief in the dark. But Mrs. Pettifer was a servant, and Mrs. Hartley was a guest with a mouth like a mail coach, and by supper the story was already leaving the house. By the next county gathering it would be everywhere. One witness had become a dozen. The account was open now, and it wanted paying. That was the second offence. The third was made for an audience. Genevieve did not do it quietly. She could have. She could have let Edmund send the girl away with a note and a story of a visit to distant relations, and the county would have whispered and shrugged and moved on. But whispers fade. Genevieve wanted something that would not fade. She wanted Eleanor's name broken so publicly, in front of such witnesses, that it could never be mended. Because a name half broken can be sewn back together, and a girl with a mended name might one day come home and ask questions. So she waited 2 more days, until the magistrates who had come for Easter were still under the roof, and she gathered the whole household into the great hall as though for an announcement, and she made her theatre. 14 of them, every servant that could be spared from the kitchen and the yard, lined along the panelled wall, the footman, the maids, the old groom, the boot boy, Mrs. Pettifer at the front with her hands folded and her face like stone. The 2 magistrates by the cold fireplace, grave men in dark coats who had come for pheasant and found themselves at a trial. Mrs. Hartley, of course, near the front, drinking it in. And Edmund Falburn in his chair, grey, sunk, a rug over his knees, coughing into a handkerchief and not lifting his eyes from the carpet. That is the part Eleanor could never forget. Not the cruelty of her stepmother. She had learned to expect that. It was her father, 3 feet away, who would not look at her. Genevieve stood in the middle of the room, where the light from the tall windows fell, and she produced the brooch, and she told the story. Cleanly, without heat. The missing heirloom. The search. The coat. The seam. The stitches. She had a way of making the truth of her lie sit in the room like furniture, and when she had finished, she turned the emerald so it caught the light, so every servant along the wall could see the green fire in it, and she said the words. "A thief," said Genevieve Falburn, "does not deserve a name she has disgraced." No one spoke. The fire crackled. One of the maids was crying without a sound. And into that silence Eleanor waited for her father to lift his head. She would have taken one word. One look. He gave her neither. He coughed and folded his handkerchief and stared at the pattern in the carpet as though it might tell him what to do, and the silence went on, and the silence was his answer. Then one voice, from the back, near the servants' door. "That's not true." A young man's voice, cracking on it, too loud in the still room. Thomas Rourke, the steward's son, 23, who had grown up on the estate the same seasons Eleanor had, who had helped her up into the apple trees when they were both children. He had pushed forward past a footman, and his face was white and furious. Miss Eleanor never took anything in her life. Anyone who's known her a day knows that. "I'll say it to the magistrates. I'll say it to—" "You'll say nothing," said Genevieve, without even turning. "You'll go back to your place, or you'll go back to your father and tell him why the family no longer has need of either of you." And a footman had Thomas by the arm, and the boy's protest died in his throat, because he had a sick father and a cottage on the estate and no money in the world, and Genevieve had just shown him, in one sentence, exactly how much his loyalty could cost him. He was put back against the wall. He stood there with his fists shut and his eyes wet, and it was 13 years before he got to finish that sentence. But he had said it. In a room where no one else dared, one person had stood for her, and Eleanor never forgot that either. They put her out at first light the next morning, not through the front, through the kitchen. That was Genevieve's own particular touch, and it told you everything about her. A thief leaves the way the tradesmen leave, the way the rubbish leaves, not down the great staircase and out under the stone porch where the family and its guests came and went. Eleanor was allowed one case. She packed it herself by candlelight in the cold box room. 2 dresses. Her linen, her mother's small portrait, wrapped in a shawl. And, at the very bottom, wrapped tighter still, the little green leather box, for Genevieve had made her point with the brooch, and then, carelessly, left the empty box in the drawer, not knowing, not caring, that it was the box and not the stone the girl would grieve for. She came down the back stair in the grey before dawn. The kitchen was warm and smelt of the first fire, and the bread already proving. Mrs. Pettifer was there. Of course she was there. She had been up half the night, and she had a small parcel of food ready, bread and cheese, and a twist of tea, pressed into Eleanor's free hand without a word, because words were dangerous now, and might be reported. But at the door, on the cold threshold with the frost blue in the yard beyond, Eleanor stopped and turned, and put her mouth close to the old woman's ear. "Keep the small green box safe for me," she whispered. "That's all. Just keep it safe. Will you?" Mrs. Pettifer could not answer at first. Then she nodded, once, hard, and gripped the girl's hand until it hurt, and let her go. And Eleanor Falben walked out through the kitchen door of the house she was born in, into the frost, with one case, and no carriage, and no name left that anyone in that valley would say aloud. And she did not weep in the yard. She walked down the tradesman's track to the lane, and she did not once look back at the west wing window where the morning sun was, that very moment, coming to look for her out of habit, and finding the room empty. Now hold that picture. Hold the girl on the frozen track. Because that is where they thought the story ended. A girl put out with nothing stays nothing, Genevieve was certain of it, certain as she was of her own name, and her certainty is the thing this whole story exists to break. It just takes 13 years to break it. Eleanor went to Liverpool. Not by grand design. She went because it was far, and because it was big, and because it was the one place in England where her name meant nothing at all, and for the first time in her life, a name meaning nothing was a mercy. In Nether Wexley she was the disgraced Falben girl. In Liverpool she was one more thin young woman off the country coach, with a single case and a careful voice, and no one there had heard the story, and no one there cared to ask. She could not touch her mother's money. That was the cruel arithmetic of those first years, and she did the sum many cold nights. The trust would not mature until she was 25. She was 19. 6 years stood between her and the one thing that was truly hers, and 6 years is a long time to a girl with a case and a loaf and the last of her nerve. So she did the only thing there was to do. She looked for work. She found it with a Mrs. Ferriby, the widow of a shipowner, a stout, deaf, demanding old woman who lived in a tall, narrow house up on the hill above the docks and wanted a paid companion. Someone to read to her, and write her letters, and bear her temper, and fetch her shawl, for very little money and a bed at the top of the house. The bed was in the attic. It was narrow and cold, and the window would not shut fully, and in winter Eleanor woke with frost on the inside of the glass. It was, in every measurable way, the box room again. She lay in it the first night and looked at the water stain on the ceiling, and she made herself a promise that she did not yet have any means to keep. She promised herself it was the last cold room anyone would put her in. And then she did a thing that saved her. She paid attention. Old Mrs. Ferriby, for all her temper, had a life's worth of the docks in her. Her husband had built a small fleet from 2 coasters. She had kept his books herself in the early years, and she still read the shipping columns every morning with a magnifying glass and a running commentary, and she still had opinions about freight and insurance and which brokers were fools. Most companions would have let it wash over them. Eleanor listened. She read the columns aloud, and then she read them again to herself at night. She learned what a bill of lading was. She learned what it meant to bond a warehouse, and how marine insurance was written, and why one cargo was a risk and another was money in the bank. She learned the difference between a thing that looked like wealth and a thing that made wealth. And she said nothing, ever, about who she had been. Not one word, not once, in 3 years. Because she had learned in that grey hall exactly what a name could do to you, and she was not ready to have one again until she could afford it. 3 years she saved, every shilling she was not forced to spend. She mended her own dresses and turned her own collars and walked where others took a cab, and slowly, in a tin box under the loose board in the attic floor, the coins became notes and the notes became a small sum. Not a fortune, nothing like a fortune. But enough, at last, to make a first move, and the first move is the hardest one there is, because it is the one you make with everything you have and no net beneath you. She was 22 when she made it. There was a bonded warehouse down near the Wapping Dock, a good sound brick building, and a half share in it came up for sale when its owner died and his sons quarrelled. Eleanor had watched that warehouse for a year. She knew its trade. She knew the man who managed it was honest and tired and wanted a quiet partner with a little capital and no wish to interfere. She took everything out of the tin box, and she added a small loan she talked a cautious bank into giving her against the trust that would mature, the first time her mother's far-off money did her any good at all, standing as a promise behind her, and she bought the half-share. It nearly broke her within the year. That is the part the stories leave out. A ship the warehouse was heavily committed to was 6 weeks overdue that autumn, given up for lost with its cargo, and Eleanor lay awake through those 6 weeks doing sums that all came out to ruin. She had staked everything. If the ship was gone, she was back on the country coach, or worse. She did not sleep. She grew thin. And then, on a grey November morning, the ship came up the Mersey on the tide, storm-battered and late but whole, and the cargo was landed and sold, and Eleanor made in 1 week more than Mrs. Ferriby had paid her in 3 years. She did not celebrate. She took the profit, every pound of it, and she put it into the next thing. The next thing was insurance. She had understood, watching that ship not come, and then come, that the real money on the docks was not in owning the cargo, but in carrying the risk of it. That the men who wrote the marine insurance took a small sure sum from everyone and paid out only to the unlucky few, and that over enough ships and enough years the arithmetic was as close to a law of nature as commerce gets. She bought a stake in a small marine insurance concern, a syndicate of careful men who were glad of new capital and did not much mind where it came from. And this time she did not stake everything. She had learned that too. She kept a reserve now. She spread her risk the way the insurers did. She was no longer the girl who bet her whole tin box on one warehouse. She was becoming something else. Day by day, ledger by ledger, not being unveiled, mind, not some secret heiress in disguise, but genuinely becoming, building the thing with her own hands and her own nerve and her own hard-won sense of how money moved and where it pooled. And then she was 25. The birthday came on a wet March morning, and with the morning came a letter she had waited 6 years for and half stopped believing in. The Liverpool solicitor, the one her mother had chosen so carefully all those years ago, wrote to inform Miss Eleanor Falben that the trust established by the late Mrs. Charlotte Falben had reached its term, and that the sum of £6,000, together with the interest accrued, was now hers to command. £6,000. She sat in her rooms. She had rooms of her own now, small but warm, and not one of them was a box room, and she held the letter and she thought of an 11-year-old girl who had thought of that money, if she thought of it at all, as a keepsake she would never touch. And she wept then, not for the money. For her mother, who had known, somehow dying in that bright west room, that her daughter would one day need something of her own that no one else could take. Charlotte had guarded it apart from the estate on purpose. Now Eleanor understood why. That same week, a second letter came, forwarded on through the solicitor. Edmund Falben was dead. He had died at the Hall, of the long illness that had been grey in his face the last morning she saw him, and he had died, the letter did not say this, but Eleanor knew it as surely as she knew the weather, still believing every word his wife had told him about his daughter. He had never written. In 6 years he had never once written to ask where she was, or whether she lived, or whether the thing they said she did was true. She read the letter twice, standing at her window with the rain on the glass and the masts of the docks grey beyond, and she waited to feel the grief break over her, and it did not come. Something else came instead, something quieter and harder and more useful. She did not go to the funeral. There was nothing for her at that grave, and she would not stand at the edge of a churchyard where the county would turn and whisper the old lie over her father's coffin. She folded the letter away. And then, being who she had become, she folded the £6,000 into her working capital, into the warehouses and the insurance and the careful spread of risk. And she put it to work, her mother's love, made at last into a tool with an edge. 5 more years passed. I will not walk you through every ledger of them, but I will tell you where they ended, because the distance is the point of the whole thing. By the time Eleanor Falben was 30, the girl who had walked out the kitchen door with 1 case and a loaf of bread controlled shipping and property interests in the port of Liverpool worth, on a careful reckoning, close to £60,000. She sat on the board of the insurance syndicate. She owned outright the warehouse she had once bought a half share of, and 2 others besides. Men who did not know her history took her advice and were glad they had. She kept her own counsel, dressed plainly, gave to the seamen's charities without her name attached, and told almost no one where she had come from. The disgraced Falben girl was gone. In her place was a quiet, formidable woman of business whom the docks called Miss Falben with respect, and never once connected to a scandal 13 years dead in a county 3 days off. But she had done one other thing in those years, and it was not about money at all. It had taken her a long time to be strong enough to do it. But once she could afford to look backward without flinching, she had set a quiet man to a quiet task, to trace, if it could be traced, what had become of her mother's emerald brooch after that Easter. It had not gone back into the family. Genevieve had had no more use for it once it had done its work. The stone had been evidence, not treasure. And the trail, when the quiet man followed it, led exactly where Eleanor, in the deepest part of her, had always known it would lead, to a pawnbroker's shop in a mean street off the Liverpool docks, Liverpool of all the towns in England, as though the thing had come to wait for her, where the emerald had been pledged for cash the very week of her expulsion, and never redeemed. Eleanor bought it back. Of course she bought it back. But that is not the part that matters. The part that matters is the ticket, because when the old pawnbroker went into his ledgers and his box of unredeemed pledges to fetch the record, he brought out the original counterfoil, the pawn ticket, yellowed now, made out and signed in the borrower's own hand on a date 13 years gone. And Eleanor stood in that dim little shop and looked down at the paper and read the name written there in a young man's careless slanting hand, the name of the man who had pawned her dead mother's brooch to cover a gambling debt, and then stood in a panelled hall and watched in silence while a girl was put out the kitchen door for the theft he had done himself. Marcus Vane. She did not say a word. She paid the pawnbroker for the brooch, and she paid him again, handsomely, for the ticket, and for his silence, and she folded that yellowed slip of paper into her pocketbook and carried it home. She did not have a use for it yet. She was not even sure she would ever have a use for it. But some instinct older than strategy told her to keep it, the way her mother had told her to keep the trust apart, the way she herself had told Mrs. Pettifer to keep the small green box safe, because the truth, she was learning, was not a shield that protected you the moment you spoke it. That was the girl's belief, the 19-year-old's belief, and the world had beaten it out of her in a frozen yard. The truth was a tool, and a tool is no good in your hand until the moment comes to use it. So she kept the ticket. She kept it against a day she could not yet see. The day was closer than she knew. It came on an ordinary evening, at her own fireside, with the county newspaper her clerk still sent up to her out of an old habit of watching the place she never named. She had almost stopped reading it, but that evening her eye caught, low on an inside page, among the notices of sales and foreclosures, 3 words set in the small hard type they use for the ruin of families. Falben Hall. Auction, and Eleanor Falben set down her cup and picked up the paper and held it close to the lamp and began to read. She read it twice, then a third time, slower. The way you count money you cannot quite believe is yours. Falben Hall. Mortgaged twice over. Foreclosed by Ridgeway and Colney Bank. £47,000 owed against it, and 90 days to auction. She sat very still. The fire ticked in the grate. Somewhere below in the house a clock struck the half-hour, and she did not hear it. She was 19 again, for a moment, standing in a frozen yard with one case in her hand and the frost coming through her thin boots. She was 19, and she was 32, and both of those women were looking at 3 words in hard small type. Marcus had done it. Of course Marcus had done it. He had come into the house on his mother's arm, and he had gambled it down to the studs. The way he gambled everything, the way he had gambled her mother's brooch across a pawnbroker's counter 13 years ago and let a girl carry the blame. He had mistaken the roof over his head for a fortune in his pocket. Men like Marcus always did. Eleanor folded the paper along its old creases. She set it on the table beside her cold cup, and she went to her writing desk, and she took out a clean sheet, and she wrote to her solicitor in Liverpool, to Mr. Alderton, the only man in England she trusted with the whole of it. She did not write pages. She had learned, in 13 years of ledgers and lading bills, that the biggest instructions fit in the fewest words. She wrote 3. Bid on everything. Then she signed her name, and she sealed it, and she rang for the letter to go down to the night post, and she sat back by the fire with her hands folded in her lap, quiet as a woman at prayer, while the thing she had kept against a day she could not see began, at last, to move. Mr. Alderton was a careful man. That was why she used him. He was grey and dry, and he had a way of blinking slowly before he spoke, so that people who did not know him thought him slow altogether. They were wrong. He read her letter in his chambers off the Liverpool docks, and he blinked, and he understood at once that his client did not want her name within 50 miles of Herefordshire. So he went down quietly. He put up at a coaching inn 2 towns from Nether Wexley, and he let it be known, where such things are let be known, that he acted for a private northern client, a gentleman of means, he suggested, with an interest in land. He never gave the client a face. He never gave the client a sex. He let the county fill in the blanks itself, and the county, being the county, filled them in with a fat industrial northerner nobody had met. Word of that phantom buyer reached the hall within the week. It reached Genevieve Falburn in the morning room where she still took her chocolate, though the chocolate was cheaper now, and the silver had gone quietly to a dealer in Hereford, and the fires were laid in only 2 rooms. She was older. The years had thinned her mouth and set 2 deep lines beside it, but her back was as straight as it had ever been, and her certainty was the last thing in that house not yet mortgaged. She was certain, still, that was her whole life, that certainty. She had built it the day she watched a girl go out the kitchen door and stay gone, and nothing in 13 years had taught her otherwise. A girl put out with nothing stays nothing. That was the law she lived by. So when she heard that a stranger from the north meant to bid on the hall, she did not tremble. She schemed. She thought of what furniture might be got out before the sale, what a soft buyer might be persuaded to lease back to her, how a widow of good family might yet keep a wing of the house she had ruined. Marcus, for his part, drank. He was 35 now, and it sat on him badly. The eager, careless boy who had scrawled his name across a pawn ticket had thickened into a heavy, unlucky man with a red face and a grievance for every hour of the day. He blamed the bank. He blamed the cards. He blamed the friends who had stopped lending. He never once, not for a single breath, blamed the man in the glass. He heard about the northern buyer, and he laughed, a wet, unpleasant laugh, and he said, "Let the fool have it," and there was always Boulogne, and he poured himself another. Neither of them thought of her. That was the thing. In all their reckoning of who might take the house, in all their courting of rumoured buyers and their late-night arithmetic of ruin, the name Eleanor Falburn did not once cross either mind. She was a closed account. She was a girl in a frozen yard who had, they assumed, gone under in some Liverpool gutter years ago, as such girls did. The dead do not bid at auctions. And down at his coaching inn, Mr. Alderton wrote his client one dry line: "All quiet. No one asks after you." He might have added, "They have forgotten you exist." He did not need to. His client knew. There was one bad hour. there is always one bad hour. A clerk at the bank, a sharp young man who handled the northern agent's letters of credit, noticed that the credit was drawn on a Liverpool shipping house and that the shipping house was held at its root by a woman. He mentioned it, idly, over his pen. He wondered aloud whether the mystery buyer mightn't be a lady after all, and a Liverpool lady at that, which was a strange thing for a Herefordshire estate. Alderton was in the room. Alderton blinked his slow blink, and then Alderton, who had not survived 30 years of clients by leaving loose threads, remarked mildly that half the shipping houses in Liverpool had a widow's name somewhere in the papers. It meant nothing. It was the way of trusts, and had the young man seen the state of the North Drive at the Hall, the drainage alone would frighten off any buyer with sense. He talked drainage for a quarter of an hour. By the end of it, the clerk had forgotten his own cleverness, and the thread was buried, and it stayed buried. Down in the kitchen passage of Falburn Hall, meanwhile, an old woman kept a small green leather box in the bottom of a locked press, under the good tablecloths that were never used now. Mrs. Pettifer was past 70. She had stayed on through everything, through the new mistress and the sold silver and the cold rooms, because a house is a house and she had nowhere else, and, if she was honest, because she had made a girl a promise at a kitchen door once, and she meant to be there when it was kept. She did not know it would be kept. She had no reason on earth to think so. But she kept the box, and she dusted the empty west wing that nobody lived in, and when she heard the talk of the auction she pressed her lips together and said nothing to anybody, and at night she took the box out and held it a while and put it back. She did not know who was coming. None of them knew who was coming. That was the whole terrible beauty of it. The county gathered itself for a sale, and Genevieve schemed, and Marcus drank, and the bank counted its £47,000, and not one of them looked north to see the tide already turned and running in. The auction was held in the assembly rooms at Nether Wexley on a grey morning at the end of October. They were fine rooms once, panelled and high, where the county had danced when the county still danced. Now they held rows of hard chairs and a table on a low days, and a smell of damp wool and cold coffee. The room filled early. Half the people there had no more money than the price of the newspaper the notice ran in. They had come to watch. They had come the way people come to a hanging, and they told themselves it was a sad thing, and their eyes were bright. Genevieve came in on the stroke of the hour, in her good black, her chin up, as though she were the hostess and not the ruin. She took a chair near the front, at the side, where she could be seen to bear it well. Marcus came in behind her, unsteady already though it was not yet noon, and dropped into the chair beside her and stared at the floor. Mr. Alderton sat 3 rows back, grey and unremarkable, a leather folder on his knee. Nobody looked at him twice. At the back of the room, near the door, in a plain dark travelling dress, sat a woman nobody knew. She had come in quietly while the room was filling. She had taken the last chair in the last row, near the door, and folded her gloved hands, and kept her veil down, and waited. She had watched Genevieve come in. She had watched Marcus fall into his chair. She had looked at the two of them for a long moment, the architect and the thief, 13 years older and grinding to their end, and she had felt, she would think about this after, she had felt almost nothing. Not triumph. Not yet. Only a great quiet, like the quiet on the water before dawn, when the whole river holds its breath. The auctioneer mounted the dies and cleared his throat and began. He praised the house. That was his trade, he praised it. He spoke of the west wing and the orchards and the tenant farms, of the situation and the standing and the ancient name of Falburn, and every word of it fell on the room like clods on a coffin, because everyone there knew what the praising meant. He came to the reserve. He came to the terms. He asked for an opening bid. There was a silence. A man from a Hereford brewery offered a low figure, testing. Another raised it. The auctioneer worked them along, 30,000, 35, coaxing, and the brewery man dropped out at 38, with a shake of his head, and a land company's agent took it to 40. And there it stuck, and the auctioneer's voice sharpened with the fear that it would stick below the debt and the whole thing collapse. Then Mr. Alderton, 3 rows back, lifted one finger. 42, said the auctioneer, and the room turned to look at the grey man they had not noticed. The northern client. The phantom. Genevieve turned in her chair to look at him too, and Eleanor at the back watched her stepmother's eyes rest on Alderton and weigh him and find him a stranger, and turn away again, unafraid. The land company came back at 43. Alderton took it to 45 without a flicker. 47, that was the debt now, that was the bank made whole, and a small stir went through the room, a letting go, because at least there would be no shortfall, at least the thing was covered. The land company hesitated. Its agent looked at his notes, and looked at Alderton, and offered 48 in a voice that had lost its heart. Alderton said 50. He did not say it loudly. He said it the way he said everything, dry and slow, but it landed in that room like a door slammed in a still house. £50,000 for a foreclosed estate in a bad year. The land company folded its notes. The auctioneer looked once around the room, at the brewery man shaking his head, at the empty air where no other paddle rose, and he lifted his hammer, and he asked, was there any advance on £50,000, and Marcus Vane laughed, that wet laugh, and muttered, let the northern fool bleed for it, and Genevieve sat straight, and still, and thought already of the terms she might beg from a soft, rich stranger. 51,000, said Alderton, bidding against nobody, bidding against the last ghost of a doubt. Because his client had written him one more line beneath the 3, and it had said leave no crack for them to argue through. £51,000. Once, twice, the hammer came down. Sold, said the auctioneer, to the client of Mr. Alderton, the purchaser will come forward to sign. And Alderton rose and gathered his folder and stepped toward the table on the dice, and then he stopped, and he stepped aside, and he turned with an old man's courtesy toward the back of the room. Eleanor Falbin stood up. She put back her veil. She walked up the long aisle between the hard chairs, past the brewery man, past the land agent, past all the bright watching eyes of the county that had once watched her go out a kitchen door, and her step was not quick, and it was not slow. It was the step of a woman walking up her own front path. The room did not know her. And then, row by row, the older ones began to know her, the ones who had been at the hall in the old days, the ones who remembered the first wife and her green-eyed girl. And a whisper went up and ran along the walls like fire in dry grass. Genevieve turned in her chair. Eleanor watched her stepmother's face across 13 years. She watched the certainty on it, that straight-backed, last thing not mortgage certainty. She watched it meet the sight of a dead girl walking up the aisle, and she watched it crack. Just a hairline, just at the corner of the thinned mouth. Genevieve's hand went out and gripped the back of the chair in front of her, gripped it white, and she did not rise, because I think she could not. Marcus lifted his heavy head. He blinked at the woman coming up the aisle the way a man blinks at a thing he has drunk himself into seeing, and then it was not drink, and he knew it was not drink, and his red face went a bad grey, and he came half up out of his chair with his mouth open on a word he never said. Eleanor reached the table. The auctioneer, flustered, turned the deed of conveyance toward her and dipped the pen and held it out, and asked, as he was bound to ask, for the purchaser's name. She took the pen. She looked once, only once, down the room at the two of them, at the woman gripping the chair and the man half risen. And then she bent to the paper and she wrote her name in a steady hand. Eleanor Charlotte Falbin, the Charlotte for her mother, in full, the way it had never once been written on any dismissal or any charge. She set down the pen. She looked at Genevieve, and she said, into the whole silent listening room, not loudly, because she had learned that the truth spoken quietly cuts deeper than the truth shouted. The name on this deed is the one you put out the kitchen door. For a moment, nobody breathed. And then Marcus Vane, who had never in his life met a hard moment he did not try to bully his way through, was on his feet, red again, shouting, "She's a thief!" His voice cracked on it. "She stole from this family. Ask anyone, ask my mother. She was put out for theft, for stealing the brooch, my grandmother's, everyone here knows it." He flung it into the room, the old lie, the same lie, thrown one last time before the same class of witnesses who had swallowed it whole 13 years before. 2 magistrates were in that room today, as 2 had been in the hall that morning. The county keeps its magistrates close. Marcus flung the lie at them, at all of them, the way a drowning man flings his weight at anything that floats. Eleanor let it hang in the air a moment. She let them all hear it, so that they would remember hearing it. Then she opened the small pocketbook she carried, and she took out a folded slip of paper, yellowed and soft with age, and she laid it flat on the table beside the deed, and she turned it around so that it faced the room, so that it faced the 2 magistrates in the second row, and she smoothed it with 2 fingers. "Then let us settle the theft," she said. "Since my stepbrother is so anxious we should." The nearer magistrate, a heavy old man named on the county bench for 30 years, leaned forward and put on his glasses and read, and the auctioneer, who could not help himself, who had the reading habit of his trade, read it aloud over his shoulder in a wondering voice. "A pawn ticket," he said, "made out by a Liverpool house for 1 emerald brooch, gold set, received against a loan of, and signed." He stopped. "Read the name," said Eleanor. "Marcus Vane," said the auctioneer. "Read the date." He read the date. It was a date in the spring of 1889, a date in the very week, as the older ones in that room could count on their fingers, that Eleanor Falben had been put out of the hall for stealing the thing that this ticket proved Marcus Vane had pawned across a Liverpool counter for a gambling debt 3 days before the household was ever told a brooch was missing. 3 days before. That was the knife of it. He had pawned it first. The theft was already done, the money already lost across a card table, when Genevieve stood in the panelled hall and drew the brooch out of the lining of a girl's coat and called that girl a name she did not deserve. Marcus's colour was gone entirely now. He stood swaying with his mouth working, and no sound in it. The 2 magistrates turned their heads and looked at one another, one long, level county look, the look of men who have signed a great many judgments and have just understood they once signed a wrong one, and then they looked at Marcus Vane, and the older one took off his glasses very slowly, and the taking off of those glasses was worse than any word he could have said. The room had found its voice. It was murmuring now, a low swelling water sound, and every face in it had turned from Eleanor to Marcus, and the turning of those faces was the whole account being paid, coin by coin, 13 years late. But Eleanor was not finished. She had come with 2 things, and she had laid down only one. She turned from Marcus, who no longer mattered, who would never again matter, and she faced Genevieve. And she reached into the pocketbook a second time, and she drew out a single sheet of paper, older even than the ticket, creased soft, and she unfolded it with great care. This she did not lay before the magistrates. This was not for them. She carried it, instead, across the little space to where Genevieve sat gripping the chair back, and she laid it down on the empty seat beside her stepmother, face up, where Genevieve, and only Genevieve, could see it plainly. "This came to Mr. Alderton with the estate papers," Eleanor said. "It was in your late husband's desk. It was never sent. I think you never knew he wrote it." Genevieve did not want to look. Everyone could see she did not want to look, but her eyes went down to the page against her will, the way eyes will, and she saw the handwriting on it, and the handwriting undid her where the whole room full of turned faces had not. It was Edmund's hand, her husband's hand, grown shaky and small near the end, but his. Eleanor did not read it aloud. She never read a word of it aloud. That was the mercy in it, and the cruelty. She only let Genevieve read her dead husband's own writing, the letter he had begun to his cast-out daughter in the last weeks of his life, and never had the courage to finish or to send. The letter in which a weak, dying man had written that he had come, of late, to doubt the whole affair. That a thing sat wrong with him, that if he had wronged his Eleanor, he prayed, there it broke off. It broke off in the middle of the prayer, unfinished, unsent, because he had died still too much a coward to mend it, and that was the truth of Edmund Falben, and always had been. But it was enough. It was his doubt, in his hand, dated in his last month, and it fell on Genevieve like the roof coming in. Her certainty broke. Eleanor watched it go, the straight back, the last thing in the house not mortgaged, the straight back bent. Genevieve Falben put one hand over her mouth, before the whole county she had ruled, before the two magistrates and the brewery man and the tenants standing at the back. And something in her face simply fell in on itself, because her husband, the weak stick she had married and managed and lied to for 13 years, even Edmund in the end, had not believed her. And if Edmund had doubted, then the architecture she had built her whole life upon, the certainty that a lie told well enough and loudly enough becomes the truth, had never been sound at all. It had been rotten from the first, and she had lived in it anyway, and now it had come down on her head in a room full of witnesses. She made a small sound, not a word, just a sound, and she looked up at Eleanor with her hand still over her mouth, and for the first time in 13 years the two of them looked at each other with nothing between them but the truth. And the truth was all on one side. Eleanor did not gloat. I want you to understand that, because it is the whole of what she had become. The girl of 19 might have gloated. The girl had dreamed, in her cold attic, of exactly this room and exactly this moment, and in the dreams she had said cruel and splendid things. The woman of 2 and 30 said none of them. She had learned that the deed matters more than the apology, and she held the deed, and so she had no need of speeches. She turned back to the table. She spoke to the auctioneer, and through him to the bank's man standing pale at the side, and her voice was level and businesslike, a merchant's voice closing a merchant's account. "The purchase money will be with your principals by Friday," she said. "The bank is to be paid in full, every farthing of the 47,000. She paused. "And the tenants are to be told today, before they sleep, that not one of their leases will be touched. Not one farm changes hands. They keep their land." A different murmur went round the room at that, warmer, and at the back some of the tenant men who had come to watch a hanging took off their hats instead. Awkwardly, not quite knowing why, only knowing that the green-eyed child they had let ride on the hay wains 30 years back had come home and made them safe. Then Eleanor gathered her papers, the deed, the ticket, and last of all Edmund's unfinished letter, which she took gently back from the chair beside Genevieve, because it was hers. It had always been meant for her, unfinished as it was. And she walked back down the long aisle, and the county stood as she passed, not all at once, but one, and then another, and then the whole room, rising to a woman it had watched thrown away. She did not go straight home. There was one more thing, and it belonged to the hall, not the assembly rooms. She had them bring the carriage round to the hall that same dusk, the estate's own carriage, that had been kept back from the sale, and she gave Genevieve and Marcus the news of it herself, on the front drive, in the failing light, under the windows of the house that was now, entirely and lawfully, hers. They came out onto the steps because there was nowhere else to go. Marcus first, sullen and broken and reeking, all his bluster drunk and shouted and shamed out of him. Then Genevieve, upright again, she had found her back somewhere in the hours between, pinned it up out of pride, because pride was all she had left to pack, but her face had gone old and grey and final, and she would not look at the girl on the drive. Eleanor stood at the foot of the steps with her hands folded, Behind her the last light lay gold along the orchard. And the smell of it came down the drive, apples and cut grass and cold coming earth, the smell of the place she was born to. "There is a carriage," she said, "to take you to the station. It is waiting. You may take what is yours, what is truly yours, and Mrs. Pettifer will know the difference, so do not trouble to pack the silver that is left. A small thing, that," and she said it without heat, but Marcus flinched. "You have until nightfall, that is the whole of it. Be gone by nightfall, and I will never speak your names again, in a court or out of one. Stay past it, either of you, and that ticket goes to the bench in the morning, and my stepbrother sleeps in a cell tomorrow night instead of a coaching inn." She looked at Marcus when she said it. He did not meet her eye. "Nightfall," she said again. "Go, that was all. No curse, no crowing, no long-rehearsed speech of the cold attic years, only the one calm sentence and the one hard condition, and the carriage door standing open in the blue dusk." And Mrs. Pettifer had come out onto the step behind them, an old woman in her black, with something held in both her hands against her apron, a small green leather box, worn at the corners, kept 13 years under the tablecloths that were never used. She did not go to Genevieve. She went, past the two of them, down the steps to the girl on the drive, and she was crying, the tears just running down the seams of her old face without any sound, and she held out the box. "I kept it safe," she said. "You told me to keep it safe, and I did. I never let it out of my hand. Not once, in all of it." Her voice went. "I knew you'd come. I told nobody, but I knew." Eleanor took the box. Her own hands were not quite steady now. The whole day had not shaken her, and this shook her. This old woman's faith kept through 13 winters. She opened the lid. Inside, on a bed of faded green velvet, lay her mother's emerald brooch. Home, recovered from a Liverpool pawnshop, carried north and north again, and here at last where it began. In the box her mother had kept it in the hands of the woman who had raised them both. Eleanor bent and kissed Mrs. Pettifer's wet cheek, and said something too low for anyone else to hear, and behind them, in the blue dark, the carriage took Genevieve and Marcus down the drive and away, and the sound of the wheels grew small. And then there was no sound at all but the wind moving in the orchard, and an old woman weeping for joy on the steps of the house that had come home to its right owner. 6 months later, the west wing was open again. They were the rooms Eleanor had been born in, on the corner where her mother had loved to sit, and she had them cleaned and aired and the shutters thrown back. And now, in the long slanting light of a late spring afternoon, she sat by the window where her mother had sat, with her mother's portrait rehung on the wall, brought down at last from the cold north box room where a frightened girl had once hidden it, and the sun came through the old glass and lay warm across the floorboards in bars of honey. Down in the yard they were at the cider press. She could smell it from the window, that sweet, sharp smell of crushed apples that is the smell of Herefordshire itself, and she could hear the men calling to one another and the press creaking round. The tenants' harvest safe and gathered under her name, every lease unbroken, every farm secure. The orchard tenants she had ridden the hay wains with as a child were old men now, and their sons ran the presses and the land held. The county paper still came up to her out of the old habit. She read it by that same window sometimes, and now and again it carried a line that touched the edges of her story. Genevieve, it seemed, had taken rooms in a spa town in the west, and lived there quietly on an income no one could quite account for, and troubled nobody. Marcus was last heard of at the tables in Boulogne, where such men are always last heard of, and then not heard of at all. Eleanor read those lines the way you read the weather in a country you have left. They no longer had any power to reach the room she sat in. There had been one letter. It came in the winter, in a hand she knew, and it was from Genevieve, and it was thick. And Eleanor guessed at its contents, without opening it, the appeal, the softening, the half-apology angling after the whole reconciliation, the old architect trying to raise one last small structure between them. Eleanor held it a while by the fire. Then she wrote across the outside, unopened, returned to sender, and sent it back that way, unread, not out of cruelty, out of the plain truth that some accounts, once closed, are better left closed, and that a woman does not owe her forgiveness to the person who most wants it. That was the last of Genevieve Falben in her life, a thick letter going back down the drive, unopened, and it was enough. She wore the brooch now. That was the thing she noticed herself doing, and smiling at. She wore her mother's emerald brooch openly, pinned at her collar, in the daylight, before anyone who cared to look, without a flicker of the old fear, the brooch that had been a keepsake, and then a weapon turned against her, and then a thing pawned in the dark by a coward's hand, and bought back, and carried home, and kept safe by faith through 13 years, and now, at last, only what it had always truly been, a daughter's inheritance from her mother. Nothing hidden in it any more, nothing to be afraid of, just the green stone catching the west wing light, warm as the light itself. There was a step in the hall, and a knock at the open door, and Thomas Rourke stood there with his hat in his hand. He was her land agent now, the steward's son, who, alone in a panelled hall 13 years ago, had stepped forward for a girl everyone else abandoned, and been sent back, and never got to finish the sentence he began. He had grown into a steady, quiet man, brown from the fields, careful with the tenants and hard with the accounts, and he had never once, in all the months of working her land, presumed on the old day or asked for thanks for it. He had come now about the drainage on the North Farms, papers in his hand, all business. Eleanor stood, and the light moved on the brooch, and she looked at him a moment in the doorway with the spring sun between them. "The north drainage will keep till after supper, I think," she said. "You'll stay and take it with me, Thomas. There's no sense you riding back in the dark." He looked at her. Whatever he had meant to say about the North Farms went out of his head. He turned his hat once in his hands, and a slow colour came up under the brown of his face, and he said, "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." And that was all of it, no more than that, a supper offered and a supper accepted, in a room full of honey light with the cider press turning below and a dead woman's portrait smiling down and a green stone warm at a living woman's throat. The rest could take its own slow time. There was time now. There was all the time in the world, and a whole home to fill it in. Eleanor Falben looked out her mother's window at the orchard going gold, at her own land, safe under her own name, and she thought, not with triumph, she was long past triumph, she thought only that they had told her, once in a frozen yard, that she would be nothing without them. They had been wrong about that. They had been wrong about everything, and the sweetest part, the part she would carry to her own last window, was that she had never once had to say so. She had only had to come home. If anyone ever told you that you'd be nothing without them, I hope, wherever you're watching this from, that you know better now. Comment the town you're watching from. I'd like to see how far Eleanor's story travels.